My name is Monica Twinar, and on behalf of the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise at the Cornell University S.C. Johnson College of Business, I'd like to welcome you to the 7th Annual Cornell Business Impact Symposium. For nearly 2 decades, the center has been conducting applied research and teaching on the growth opportunities companies pursue through competitive strategies that address the world's most pressing social and environmental challenges. We offer a number of programs, events, and activities for residential students. And we are pleased to announce that we are launching an online sustainability curriculum through eCornell for the general public in the coming months. We are excited to partner with eCornell to host this online symposium, which is only possible because of the hard work of a lot of people who deserve recognition. First, thank you to all the students from the 6 graduate and undergraduate clubs that collaborated with the center to organize CBIS. Also, I want to thank my center colleague, Sophia Abdulhamid, for all her efforts that make this possible every year. Finally, I especially want to thank Abigail Dadio with the Voice Club, who worked so hard to conceptualize tonight's panel and made it a reality. It's been a real pleasure working with her on this panel. With that, I want to turn it over to Abby, who will introduce tonight's session.
Thank you, Monica. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Abby Dadio, and I am a junior at Cornell studying Environment and Sustainability Sciences. I'm also the lead of the Brands and Partners team for Voice at Cornell, which is a part of the greater Voice DAO community. I'm also a part of the expert network at OnePointFive. So today we have 3 leaders from the sustainability consulting startup firm OnePointFive joining us today. Before we begin the discussion, I'd like to invite Neil, Matthias, and Julia to introduce themselves. Thank you for being here, and I'd like each of you to please explain the role that you have at OnePointFive, a little bit about your academic and/or professional background, and some information about your area of climate expertise. Neil, if we could start with you, and then Matthias, and finally, Julia.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby. My name is Neil Yeo, and I'm the CEO and founder of OnePointFive. We're looking to basically democratize access to sustainability experts so that we can drive solutions to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And ironically, as Abby said, we do work not only in services, but also with climate technology companies, finance, and also policy and justice and advocacy. So there's a lot of work that we do. An introduction to myself really quickly. I'm originally from Australia. I studied robotics engineering and business, really felt that I wanted to use problem solving to create change in the world. Didn't know social entrepreneurship was a thing. Ended up at management consulting, which maybe many people can relate to. Did that for a bunch of years, appreciating the structured problem solving of management consulting, but not necessarily the application of what it was for. I ended up doing my MBA at Oxford University, where I was exposed to the energy and environment world much deeper as the kind of the climate change lead or the environmental lead, which actually took me to Kenya, working in off-grid solar and agri-tech, where I saw technology just step change society's needs. And that's where I ended up actually running a venture philanthropy fund in New York from 2016 to 19, where I reviewed over 2,000 startup applications in climate technology, ran diligence on 400, invested in 70, helped them to fundraise, to commercializing their technology. And that's where I found the need. Basically, to commercialize new technologies, it's not just about the check sometimes. It's about being able to actually draw the pilot projects, the commercialization of the product market fit, so much more to that. And so I actually started to personally invest my own money, both in the public sector as well as the private sector from my experiences. And whilst I was at Yale doing a mid-career master's of environmental management, which bought me time to get the right visa to start OnePointFive, the rest has been history. We've been able to do about 35 projects to date with 17 different customers, I think, now across Europe, America, and Asia. And a lot of that has been helping drive forward some of this thought leadership in climate finance and making it much more tenable for individuals to know how they can get involved, regardless of whatever tier of finance they're in. So that's me.
Great, thanks for that amazing introduction, which Sorry, I'm actually at an airport, so I might just pop it over to Julia quickly to introduce. And when this announcement's over, I can continue with my intro.
Thanks, Matthias. Hey, everyone, I'm Julia. I'm actually a fellow Cornellian. I graduated in 2014, and I studied applied economics and management. So I was an AIM. I guess they switched to Dyson School when I was there. And within AIM, I specialized in finance. And I took a similar track to, I think, a lot of my classmates after college, and I ended up in consulting. At that time, it seemed like you were either going to a bank or consulting if you were in my major. And I actually was at Ernst & Young or EY for a little over 6 years after graduation. And within there, my focus was actually financial services consulting. So I was intimately familiar with the financial services sector, and all my consulting projects were with essentially large financial institutions. During my time there, I knew it was not necessarily the right place for me. And I'd always been following sustainability and interested in what was happening in the world, but never really knew if I could work in it without getting a degree. And at the end of 2021, was it? Yes, the end of 2020, I decided to take a break from consulting and figure out how I could get into the sustainability space and what exactly I wanted to do and what I wanted to focus on. And my interests brought me to educating myself. I took a course on sustainable food and ag, which I was personally really interested in. And eventually I found my way to OnePointFive. And I joined OnePointFive at the end of last year. Currently a senior associate there. And I do a little bit of everything. I'm involved in project work, also in the internal operations side, business development. So it's been, I think, around 3 to 4 months now. And I've learned more in these 3 to 4 months than I had in a lot of time spent in consulting. So it's been wonderful and just, a wonderful experience. And I will pass it to Matthias. Hopefully the announcement is over.
And that's an official standing announcement. I'll do my best though. So my name is Matthias. I'm from Australia originally. My background is also in management consulting. Currently at the airport right now, so I apologize on the background. I started off at a fairly sort of normal track from university. I ended up at PwC. And I was initially an auditor, working with a lot of financial statements and then really understanding the underlying sort of language behind business. I switched into consulting, as a lot of people do, and was working in M&A strategy and also operations consulting. When I ended up doing my MBA, I'd worked in Japan previously and ended up loving the country. Ended up doing an MBA first off in Japan, in Tokyo, and the second year in the US as well. And along that journey, I started to do some sort of, soul searching about what I wanted to do with my skill set, especially around problem solving and consulting, and what I could actually solve in terms of making an impact and aligning a career that I really felt that was something I wanted to spend, my waking sort of hours with during the hours of 9 to 5 on Monday to Friday. And as Julie and Neil know, that is a low estimate, of course. But what I found was when I started doing this research, in the region that I was living, about I think 220 million people would be displaced with an average warming increase of 2 degrees Celsius. And what really sort of struck me at the time was how much there was such a lack of urgency from the people that were around me. And that sort of lit a fire in that if I could sort of identify this problem, something that I could actually contribute to solving, it's something that was absolutely a pursuit that I wanted to take. And so out of business school in the US, I started working with Cambium Carbon, a reforestation startup that just got about 3 million of seed funding as of this month. But I was working as director of finance there and moved into the director of software. And from there, I actually started working with OnePointFive on a climate finance project where Neil and I first started working together, and we haven't stopped since. So at OnePointFive, I'm a founding partner. About 50% of my sort of time is spent on projects around climate tech, climate finance, and services. And then the other 50% is spent on startup operations building, especially managing this experts network of interdisciplinary experts that we believe are a fantastic way to solve climate solutions in a way that we can deploy these experts onto projects in a much more streamlined, effective, and we believe solutions-driven way as well. So great to be here, and I'll go on mute so you guys don't hear too many more announcements from LaGuardia International Airport.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for giving us that insight. I know, especially being a student myself, I love to hear about the journey that you had, both from an academic and professional standpoint, because it's really interesting to learn how you can get from one place to another. And it's definitely inspiring, especially as a student. So I hope all the other students listening appreciate that as well. So before we get into the discussion, I just want to encourage all of the students and the other people listening out there today to ask questions throughout this panel. As you write the questions, I'll definitely be filtering through them because we have a general structure for the panel. But you guys really make this conversation more interesting, and we really want to hear from the audience to know what people are interested in and how we can do our best to serve everyone listening. So feel free to ask questions throughout this discussion. If I don't get to it right away, we'll definitely get to it later. And we're also going to save 10 minutes at the end to just dive into Q&A for whatever other questions remain. And so we have organized today's panel, Climate Finance with 1.5 experts, into 3 sections. So firstly, we will introduce who and what 1.5 is, and we will learn about the general concept of climate finance. Secondly, we will dive into the specifics of climate finance as it relates to the private and public sectors. And then for our third and final section, before we leave room for Q&A, we will discuss climate risk and impact as it relates to climate finance. So let's get into our first section on 1.5 and climate finance as a whole. And so for our first question, I want to ask Neil and Matthias, can you tell us about 1.5 and the types of clients that you typically serve?
Sure. Yeah, I can start and Matthias can continue. Basically, as I mentioned, we have 3 different verticals and then one that's underlaying, and we can share all this information later, but we basically work on everything that's climate or sustainability services related. The whole concept is we can do a lot of this work remotely. And so that's everything from sustainability strategy to operations, materiality assessments to reporting and analytics and whatnot. Within there, probably the most interesting part is the fact that we can do both the business and environmental modeling, which is actually a real key case for economics and business people and finance people to have a huge play when it comes to climate. Specifically, a lot of companies are trying to decarbonize to like net zero. And the only way that they can do that is by actually combining environmental knowledge, like the measurement of what our current impact is, but actually what can we invest into that will both have a return on investment, but also a return on impact in terms of the climate change route. And you'll be surprised how there aren't people who can combine those two, but the fact that our core team are like basically business people who've moved into environment, we actually have that advantage to do both. Then we also have climate technology, where we work with Series A climate technology companies to help them to commercialize or to do US market entry. So we've done things such as build carbon measurement models for like a B2B SaaS software company so that they could basically create automations around measurement of carbon emissions of logistics companies to e-commerce to whatnot. And then we also finally have the climate finance route. And that one's quite an interesting one. We'll leave it to, I guess, later. But in 2 ways we've been doing that work is one is giving access to expertise to actually evaluate. So when you're actually doing due diligence on an investment, say a new climate technology, how do you know whether that new battery technology is actually impactful or has commercial potential? Even the best venture capitalists out there won't really know unless they really understand the technology. And it was the same problem that I had when I was running my venture philanthropy fund, was that I had to basically find these scientists or technology people in bespoke areas to tell me, do you think this technology is right or wrong? And so what I wanted to do with 1.5 is to provide that, with the fact that we have that expert network, maybe we can talk to a direct air capture carbon person or a battery expert and actually provide that. And so we did that for a couple of family offices, providing that information to their investment committee to make decisions on investing at the Series A mark. And I feel by doing that, we're much more effectively channeling investment in the right way. And then we also do some stuff in forward-looking GHG emissions measurement, but we'll talk about that later. And then the final element, I guess Matthias can possibly talk about, which is around like our ecosystem and capacity building.
Yeah, I can jump in there as well. What we found is that part of a lot of the strategy that's required in, I guess, shaping your business with regards to climate, policy plays an incredibly strong role in driving your activities as a business. So we've been working quite closely with sort of Series A climate tech companies and working in the policy and advocacy space, especially in the US, where there's a lot of climate risk policy that is historically being written as we speak. The SEC released their last mandatory sort of rules that they'd proposed. And that is one of the most historical climate-related policies that we've seen come out. Now, it's not set in stone just yet, but a lot of people are commenting on this legislation at the moment, as it'll drive a lot of things around disclosing climate risk. And so we see there's an incredible role where we can play, where we can translate some of the technology that's out there in the climate space into this policy world as well. And we think that's also going to translate into better business outcomes for the solution providers that are going to drive solutions in the climate space. Another sort of area that we've been working with is building educational programs and trying to help with democratizing access to climate knowledge. We've just finished our 5-week curriculum with something called the Climate-Based Fellowship. You can Google that at home, but it was about 150 fellows from around the world, almost getting a mid-career accelerator, I guess, crash course into climate fundamentals and various different climate verticals to understand how they can make an impact in the climate space in a really short period of time. So I might wrap that up and move on to the next question.
Perfect. And just quickly before we dive into, what is climate finance and defining that, I wanted to ask Julia, especially being a Cornell grad, and I know all of you have worked in management consulting, but can you just tell us a little bit about what is different about 1.5 from other consulting firms, and what are some key things you've noticed that are different?
Sure, yeah. And all of us have had experience in Big Four consulting, and I do have to say they're probably quite similar to each other, even as much as they might tell you otherwise. But I think the biggest difference for me is, in the past, I used to be on maybe one project for a year, 6 months, 18 months, with one client focused on really one thing. And the reason I'd gotten into consulting was to be able to experience just a lot of different things. I wanted to constantly be learning. And I just wasn't getting that. I think where 1.5 is different, one, you're able to work on a lot of different projects at once, serving very different clients. As Neil and Matthias mentioned, we were working with climate tech startups. We're also working with nonprofits, larger organizations. We're doing an education fellowship. And so just the variety and richness of content has been amazing. But also one of the ways that we differ is with our model. We have a core team, the people you see here, and a few others. And then we have our expert network. And Abby, you're part of that network. And the network has individuals who might still be in school, who are pursuing secondary degrees, who have been working in the space from anywhere from 2 to 10 to 20 years. And so we have just this breadth and depth of experience in the expert network. And we are kind of humble in that we know the three of us cannot solve climate change alone. And climate change is across all industries and all sectors. And so you need knowledge across all these different areas. And so when we have projects, we're able to choose the exact experts that we think will be able to execute well and actually give the clients the solutions that they need efficiently and quickly, and hopefully within a year's time. So just the model itself has kind of brought to light what you can do remotely, not having to be in person, and just with able to get different experts on projects. Yeah, it's been great.
Yes, thank you for mentioning the expert network. Obviously, we're all familiar with it, but it has been, just for me so far, a really great experience to connect with all these different climate experts. And, collaboration is going to be key to solving these huge climate issues. And so now, kind of to transition us sort of to the next section, but right before that, I want to just ask Neil and Matthias, firstly, how do you define climate finance? And secondly, why is there a need for climate finance? So maybe Neil, you could start with the definition, and Matthias, you could explain the need.
Sure. So this is just off the cuff for me, not like a written definition. So definitely search it yourself. But I would say it's basically the trillions of dollars that it's a discipline of in the private and the public sector of how much financing, or the trillions of dollars that we need to invest into the future solutions and transitioning our current existing industries to like basically a net zero by 2050 goal. Climate finance has come up in a very new format where it used to be basically more about the ESG side of things, where it's environment, social, and governance. And if you're interested in that, like, you can look up S&P Global and a bunch of other places that have ESG ratings. But part of the problem with ESG versus climate finance was that ESG was always kind of combining the three verticals together. So effectively back in the day, and it may be different these days because it's a bit more vigorous, you could have, say, an even board of men and women. So a company that has a good G, and basically a finance company could slap on an ESG and say, that's an ESG investment, even though it had zero E to do with it. So climate finance, I think, is doing justice where you're focusing very much on the E and what we need to do in order to transition existing companies into a net zero future. So that's that.
And then just backing up some stats, I think we have around 2.8 to 4.3 trillion of US dollars that's required to plug something called the climate finance gap at the moment, which is an incredible amount if we think about the annual requirement, about 166 to 322 billion per year that's required to plug the amount of funding that we require to solve for these solutions to get to what Neil had mentioned, our target 2050 date. Within that, if you compare just climate technology venture capital funding, right? So this is early stage funding. Last year we only had 40 billion of that for 2021. And of course that's increasing as we go. I think at the moment, climate tech funding is around 30% of total venture capital funding. So it's exceeded AI, for example, as an investment theme. What's interesting in what we're actually funding as well is important. So we talk a lot about mitigation, which is where we were talking about decarbonization and trying to reverse the impacts of climate, but we're not really talking about adaptation and some of these locked in impacts that are already baked into our system because we've already exceeded a bunch of these thresholds. We already have carbon in the air, which drives a lot of inclement weather that we already need to deal with. This sort of area of domain is called adaptation. And right now we're spending around 20% of our funding on adaptation and 80% on mitigation. But this is where things get a little bit scary. We're predicted to have around 160 billion worth of adaptation costs annually, right? And so you can see right now that there's not enough money that's being invested right now. And these numbers are just going to increase if we're not addressing this gap as soon as possible. So those are a couple things that I think are salient for me when I'm thinking about why we need climate finance and why we need to deploy them correctly and in the right sort of proportions and in a timely fashion as well.
Great. So some of the key things I just want to highlight that have been said are: one, climate finance is not ESG investing. ESG investing is focused on, environmental, social, governance. Climate finance is more the E, as Neil said, and I think that's just a key differentiator. And then also, I really like how Matthias brought up the component of adaptation, because so often I feel like we talk about mitigation, but obviously, as anyone who has studied something about the environment, there are some serious problems that we continue to contribute to as a society, as a world. And at some point, we have to admit, okay, we have to prepare for the impacts that these problems will continue to have, instead of pretending they're not happening and trying to keep mitigating when some of these things are going to continue happening anyway. So that's a good transition into our second sector, our second part of the conversation, where we want to discuss public versus private climate finance. And so, Neil, I'll direct this question at you, but just for our audience, some of the major sectors of climate finance are the public sector, the private sector, as well as things like Voice DAO, which relates to Web3 and more innovative and a more developing sector. So OnePointFive mostly deals with the public and private sectors. So can you define how climate finance differs in these sectors? And if you had a client from the public sector versus the private sector, what are their focuses in terms of in terms of climate finance?
Yeah, so this is a good differentiation. I'd say that 1.5, we primarily focus on private sector, meaning what I mean is like private investments, so private equity, the venture capital, things that aren't publicly listed on something that you can publicly trade. And that's extremely important differentiation to what I personally do as an accredited investor, is that I do have a whole entire portfolio that includes like publicly traded ESG ETFs to REITs and other types of investments. I'm happy to talk about those two separately, and none of us have our Series 65, so we have to be very careful not to give financial advice. In the climate space, it's more about what we've personally done. But very specifically, I think the interesting part that we're getting pinged at 1.5 about is a lot in the private sector. So what we're hearing funds doing right now, so we're actually talking to like funds that are run by like Al Gore, to like Breakthrough Energy Ventures, to TPG Rise, to Lower Carbon Capital, Prime Impact Fund, Azola Ventures, Full Cycle, Circulate Capital. So all these funds that are actually funding at the early stage. What I'd say is the seed to Series A stage, so like very early stage climate technology companies, broad spectrum across nature-based to engineered type technology solutions, all the way to growth stage companies, which is more like the Full Cycles of the world, the Prime Impact Fund 2. What we're hearing directly from them, so the big difference is that we need both types of investment dollars. Probably what you're reading online, if you're like an everyday person, is more about the public sector, which is like, what ETF should I invest in, or what stock should I invest in that's most like ESG? Unfortunately, the public sector has a limit to what they can do there right now, because you're basically creating a mechanism to try to rate existing company practices to the quality of the ESG space. And unfortunately, because there isn't like one standard to do that rating, you actually have to run your diligence relatively like robustly. So a key example there is, if I invested in an ESG ETF, which I have, so take Stash Capital, which I probably shouldn't rat them out, but anyway, Stash Capital, I wrote them in my Forbes article, which I'm happy to share as a link here for millennials. They actually have an ESG ETF that's called carbon, like carbon good or something. It's like literally has carbon tag on it. If you actually click underneath, and this is something I would do if I'm evaluating an investment stock on Robinhood or whatever, I found out that basically the majority holdings are Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook. And that's because they defined the ESG component that they are the best E, because they're investing in like solar, 100% renewable type servers. And so in the public sector, there's a lot of debate around how vigorous ESG ratings are. And Matthias can talk about how they're improving that with like climate risk intelligence now to really evaluate climate risk exposure. But in the private sector, what we're looking at is, yes, one, providing experts to provide insight to these funds to invest these dollars more effectively. Because when you're earlier stage in the private side of companies, startups are a dime a dozen, and it's very difficult to actually get the full perspective of all the different companies that are out there. And in fact, I kind of wrote this in my research at Yale, and it's a practical report where we actually interviewed a ton of investors. I just put it in the chat to be shared with you, but basically at a very early stage, it's kind of like a leaky pipeline, right? You don't know the latest companies unless they promote themselves out there, and the ones that shout the most aren't necessarily the most effective for what we need in society. And so what we try to do is help like scientists like translate their business ideas to business outcomes and funds to invest those dollars. But the second biggest trend that we found is a lot of LPs and GPs right now, so the people who are investing into these funds, including individuals, by the way, who can actually invest through like special purpose vehicles and whatnot, is they actually want to know for every dollar that I spend, how much GHG am I actually reducing, right? That's the key thing, right? We want to know how much that's actually occurring. But because the innovation and technology space is ever evolving, basically there hasn't been a standard that looks at forward-looking GHG emissions reduction. And so a lot of these funds are trying to figure that out. And that's what we believe that we can help with, because we have life cycle analysis modelers, like environmental modelers. Like we know how to basically help to model those type of things to give an estimate. Will this company actually displace existing technology and be a more sustainable type of technology type? And so a lot of that work right now is on the measurement and impact side. Which if you are interested to learn more and just want to dive into it, the Crane tool, we actually help to run user interviews for this climate technology company in order to evaluate what the GHG reduction potential of different technology types are. So I'll just pause there.
Great. Thank you for, clarifying that differentiation. I think it's really important, especially given everyone does think of the public sector. And just to kind of mention Voice DAO, the first thing that Voice DAO does is we write reviews, and we actually have a lot of reviews written on different ETFs and different things you can invest in that would be considered sustainable. And so I'm glad that you mentioned that, because there's a lot of greenwashing and it can be really confusing about what is sustainable. And so my next question is, just to talk more about the private sector, because this is more of an ambiguous sector in terms of climate finance and what the general public might know about this. Matthias, I'll direct this question towards you, but can you tell us more about what tools that you use to assess like strong climate investments, whether that be a venture capital investment or something like that? Can you tell us more about the tools that you use and kind of what you're looking for when you're doing due diligence?
Yeah, so I think in the due diligence process, there's the process of due diligence is pretty standardized in terms of there's a data room, there's a bunch of information, there's occasionally ability to interview some sort of key individuals or experts. But what you're trying to do is almost like kick the tires on a new car, and you're looking for gaps in your assessment where you can understand those risks and also understand things like the upside of that investment. And so you're likely looking at things from a perspective of how good is this technology from a climate perspective? How effective is it relative to its sort of existing investments? In existing incumbent technology at reducing carbon from that specific type of activity or process. So we call this something like a performance metric. And I think the tool that Neil just shared before, the Crane tool, has this similar approach. So you look at the performance metric, and then you understand how is this business going to sort of grow over time, since we're usually addressing this at the early stage. So the business model is still being built, right? But if you think about it from this perspective, even if you have the best performing type of technology, if you only sell 5 of them, that's a really small amount of impact. It doesn't matter how good the technology is. And so we think about that in the EV market. EVs make up something like 10% of total cars. And we see in places like California, we're seeing 2030 a mandatory switch to all EV vehicles, right? And so what we're seeing there is this differential between what we're at now at 10% and what kind of impact that could create versus a full uptake of 100% in the market. And so this is where we're actually seeing some combination of, I guess, business analysis as well as environmental science understanding. And this is where our, I guess, environmental and financial modeling sort of skill sets come to fruition, I suppose. That's how some of the due diligence is done for some of these early stage investments. Taking an example of something like breakthrough energy ventures, right? So you've got Bill Gates, billions of dollars, wants to actually deploy his capital in some way that is impactful. What they're actually doing at Breakthrough Energy Ventures is thinking about the really big macro scale of technologies and looking at where the cost curves are relative to existing technologies, right? So an example here, the cost of solar has gone down significantly over the last 20 to 30 years. And now it is cheaper than the incumbent fossil fuel alternatives. And now what you have take over is the market then will just diffuse renewable energies throughout the market because of the lower price, the cost curve. Now, Breakthrough Energy Ventures uses the same type of approach for other technologies out there. How can we invest in something so it gets to the level of scale required in order for the cost curve to come down, which then drives more investment into that sort of new technology as well. And that's a completely different way of investing, but still in the private sector sort of side of things as well. Just to contrast how, I guess, a market maker can influence investing when they're throwing a lot of capital into the pipe versus maybe smaller investors that are trying to just pick the right sort of winners. To the first point about how we're doing that analysis, though, it's really important to make those assessments about performance, because as we see, one, we don't have enough money going into the space, and two, we don't have time. And so if we actually miss out on the right investments to back, we actually might lose these key technologies that we need in order to get to 2050 and avoid sort of climate crisis and avoid these sort of worsening thresholds that we have. And that's sort of this sort of dilemma that a lot of this innovation has when it comes into contact with the investing side as well. And why we think having expertise involved allows us to make better decisions, which hopefully drives the right technologies to market.
Definitely. I like how you mentioned scalability in that if we have EVs, but not people aren't using them, then that's not going to make a big difference. And that's just a really important thing to mention, because we have to not only identify what we should be investing in and what we should be supporting, but figuring out how to bring it to market and have people adopt that. And so I want to move on to the next section due to time purposes about talking about climate risk and how to maximize impact. I think that's especially important given that we're talking about finance. Finance, we always talk about risk. And then in terms of impact, there can be a lot of misunderstanding about what climate finance is related to impact, or what people think of as ESG investing and how that relates to impact. So first, I want to ask Julia, can you define climate risk for us and also provide some examples of what climate risk would be? And that can be examples that are in general, or examples from what your clients are concerned about.
Sure. And I will also have a similar disclaimer to Neil that this is not a textbook definition, but the way that I understand climate risk. So generally you can think of climate risk as physical risk, and there's also transition risk. So physical risk is you have your acute and then chronic. So acute risks, when you think about wildfires, hurricanes, these are like event-driven hazards that we've all kind of been experiencing, or at least seeing happen in the world. I think more and more in the past few years. Chronic risks are less detectable, but they kind of happen over time. So if you think about sea level rise over time, growing and growing. If you think about like ocean acidification, land degradation, these aren't necessarily things that you can observe happening day over day, but over time they can have really strong impacts. So that's on the physical risk side. And then on the transition risk, I think this is a fairly new term, but essentially it refers to the fact that the economy has to transition to a low carbon economy. I think that much is clear. And so companies face transition risk because they don't know what regulations are going to be coming this year versus next year versus 5 years down the line. As Matthias mentioned earlier, the SEC just announced rules that are probably going to go into effect this December. And so this is going to be happening more and more frequently in the next 8 years. There's going to be perhaps carbon tax or other policies. And so companies have to start being aware of these. And so when we talk about climate risk, and when we mentioned ESG ratings earlier, I think where ratings can go wrong, or at least where they can be misleading, is that they're not actually rating what a company's impact is, but rather how exposed they are to climate risk. And so if they have low exposure, then theoretically they have a higher rating, but does that mean that they're actually low impact? And so when we talk about climate risk, and you talk about whether you're exposed to climate risk, companies have to start looking at their portfolios and their assets and what they're invested in. We're actually helping one of our clients. It's a company that is a startup, and they have climate risk intelligence software where you're able to look at a portfolio of assets around the world and see what the climate risks are at each one of those assets and project that out through 2100. So that's extremely valuable information because asset managers, building owners, Walmart CEO can look at their portfolio and identify if certain areas maybe they should be divested from, maybe they'll have a risk of stranded assets. And so climate risk, I think, in the financial world wasn't really a thing until very, very recently. When I was working at EY, I did a lot of risk management and non-financial risk management. And I think climate risk only started being discussed or talked about in 2020. So I think this is fairly new for the finance industry, but definitely extremely important.
That's a great point about how new this topic of climate finance is and climate risk, because even though it's something that we might be thinking about as, environmentally concerned people, it is a new topic and it's still being developed. So as much as you guys know about it, it's a constantly changing field, which is what makes it so interesting. So I know someone asked a question that we're going to get to at the end about how can we get involved in this field. And so I'm excited to talk about that later. But one question I wanted to know is, what are ways that we quantify risk in assessing private and or public investment or climate finance decisions? And I also just want to make a correction that before I said public versus private sector, when really we're talking about public versus private markets. And Neil kind of clarified that by explaining public market is stocks and what we can look up. But we're talking about the markets more than the sector themselves. So just to reiterate the questions, and I'll direct it at Neil, and if Matthias wants to add anything, what are ways that you quantify this risk that Julia was talking about?
Of course, I'll talk about that. And just if people are interested in public and private sector investment, that CBA Yale article that I shared or report is really helpful, where we actually need public sector like grant funding to create risk-tolerant patient capital, which is what's required for the R&D, the research and development phase of climate technologies. Because, literally you can't commercialize something overnight without funding that allows testing. And that's not really necessarily venture capital funding all the time. And so how do you quantify that risk? I mean, we call it value at risk. Basically, once you have a climate risk measure, the next step is to decide, well, what is the value at risk? And Matthias can definitely go into more detail, but it's notoriously difficult to do that, first of all, because climate modeling in itself, when you go further and further out, like no one can necessarily agree on the damage models for climate because there's so much integrated niche parts of climate science that are involved in even coming up with the metric first. How do you actually determine what impact, like what the actual dollar impact it is? But that modeling is possible. And I guess, Matthias, did you want to sort of talk about anything that's happened there?
Yeah, so in that space, you can use something like your probability of default, for example, on an asset, probability of loss, which is used a lot in the insurance industry. And that's a way of assigning a value to the cost of the actual asset. And you can use things like historical costs, you can use the actual valuation amounts. It depends on what type of business or how you see the assets. But it allows you to then essentially match your risk as a type of probability, and then sort of align that with the value of your asset. And the various sort of damage or predicted damage connected to that could be things like future repairs and maintenance. If you have extreme wind that's blowing off lots of roofing from your building portfolios, how much is that going to result in added repairs and maintenance, for example? How is this going to relate to sea level rise to your hotel properties, and therefore capital resiliency works that you're upgrading, which results in sort of cash outflows to your financial models and your business as well. So it can get very, I guess, technical. It uses a lot of Bayesian, I guess, probability, which people that have a background in statistics might be familiar with. But it's looking at, I guess, normal distribution curves and looking at the tails to understand where the probability of loss is relative to the assets that you have in your portfolio as well. I think the final thing I'll say on this is that for climate risks, there's multiple risks that are out there. And a lot of the time, insurance companies, for example, will focus primarily on a single risk. They'll look at flood risk models or a hurricane model. But we know that there's actually correlation between various different signals or these different climate risks. So water stress is related to drought, which is related to wildfires, for example. And so you need to then almost multiply these various different risks together, or put them in as parameters into your algorithm, into your model, to then drive an output which shows how at risk you are, and therefore what's the potential value at risk of your portfolio. So I might pause there and move back to having.
Great. So we sort of touched upon this a little bit, but we received a question from the audience that fits in pretty well with this sector. So from Livy, she asked, how is a climate audit conducted to determine climate risk for a private or public organization? So I know, Matthias, you mentioned an algorithm and how you can input different climate factors, but can you talk us through what this audit process sort of looks like, and maybe like using an example of one company versus another?
This is a great question and is being debated right now with the SEC announcing this piece of work. So essentially how an audit usually works, you'll have a company essentially report on their activity, and then you'll have an auditing company like a big four company like, say, Deloitte or PwC or KPMG, et cetera, and they'll assess and review those declarations that companies have about their performance. This is how it's supposed to work in the future with climate auditing, in a similar type of fashion, where you have auditors providing opinions on whether they believe this is, materially accurate or not, based on what a company is disclosing. Now, at the moment, this is the controversial point that is trying to get debated at the moment with the SEC, because naturally it increases things like compliance costs and regulatory costs. First of all, the companies are still early in their journey, unfortunately, and the auditing companies are similarly early in the journey. So you've got a lot of people throwing resources at trying to report about climate risks at the company level, And then you've also got auditors coming in to validate those statements that they're assessing. But I guess we haven't really talked about the baseline here. What are we actually auditing towards, right? What are the standards that we actually need to focus on, and what are the frameworks that make sense? Because without standardization, we actually don't have a good way to compare apples and apples. And that's where this is important, because we're talking about, for public markets, for example, we're driving investment into companies that run themselves better, right? And so they need to be easily compared so you can make better investments into the better company. And that's where we're seeing a convergence of these, I guess, sustainability standards that you might have seen before, like GRI, or the Global Reporting Initiative. We have SASB, or the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is being swallowed up and going to be something called the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB. And they have the ex-CEO of Danone, one of the, I guess, front runners of scope emissions disclosure in the world. But this is what's happened in accounting, where you have these frameworks and standards that everyone uses, and then you have a way that you audit against those set of standards, which then allows you to then make those apple-to-apple comparisons, which then can drive investment and climate finance in the right sort of ways. So it's a great question, because this is where we need to go, but we're still figuring out how to do this correctly. I think figuring out all these accounting standards and converging all these things has taken like 50 years. So the question is, how do we do this, and how do we do this quickly? How do we get everyone to arrive at a conclusion of how we do this? And then how can we keep transparency and accountability through a transparent auditing process as well, which allows investors to really understand what's under the hood of these companies, how at risk are they?
And you bring up the really good point of time and urgency. These climate change is a problem happening now. It's been happening, and we don't have much more time to prevent ourselves from going over this 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. And so now that it's, we have less than 10 minutes left, I really want to move to the audience questions. And so one question that I think fits in sort of well with this theme of time, and we need a lot of different things to change, and everything's still developing in order to really address this problem, which is the climate crisis. One question that we have from the audience is, how do we force companies to meet our 2050 goals if they have profit-driven incentives that may not comply with these vitally important goals? And so another way that we can phrase this question from S is, how can companies translate their profit-driven incentives to maximize climate impact? So maybe Neil, you can tell us about this relationship.
Yeah, my answer to this, like 2 years ago, would be different to today. So basically, like 83% of companies are experiencing climate risk. So the C-suite know for a fact that if they continue on with what they're doing, it's literally not going to be sustainable. Like whether they care or not in the term that they're in, I think that's what's really flipped. And also Gen Zers and like the next generation, like we've shown up. And like companies are freaking out about that. They know that we're going to be the future. And definitely there's some companies that are much more, they're much more on the forefront of, being impacted by individual public opinion versus like big oil and gas firms who may not care right now. So I totally agree. So I think how we actually force this is kind of similar to what Matthias was sort of saying. Like if we're talking about from a macro lens is that the better that we get at modeling out what climate risks are, and being able to like label or measure that in a standardized way for different companies, and tie, like if you're on Bloomberg and you're investing in a company, being able to tie that to climate risk, the more accountable these companies are going to be towards what they're doing when it comes to climate impact. And we're not that far away. Like, to be honest, like, we can get there in the next year or two. There is just so much investment going there, but we do need a bit more collaboration amongst the different players, because unfortunately capitalist markets are like, everyone come up with their different version of Google until Google comes up, right? And unfortunately with climate, we really need to aggregate a lot of data sets so that we can actually get to the same kind of way forward. So that's one thing. The other thing is to be able to call, like, I guess, the greenwashing that's occurring out there and being more knowledgeable about that. So there's two quick examples I'd sort of say. One is that net zero has been very misused. And so if you check out UN Global Compact, there's tens of thousands of companies signing up right now. But net zero is supposed to be reducing as much emissions as possible and then offsetting the rest. But everyone is just trying to offset based off their baseline and then calling it net zero. And that's not literally what is the concept. But what people at Cornell can do, and this is kind of linking to the career side, is the fact that we have business and economics and finance people in this room. That's absolutely perfect. Like, we actually need people to draw the line on the ROI of what it means to be climate progressive. Like, if we actually invest into like solar and renewables and other types of technologies, if we model it correctly, it can look very financially feasible for companies. But unfortunately, a lot of sustainability departments don't actually they have much more environmental skill sets than they do the business and finance skill sets. So they can't really translate that to the C-suite and say, hey, look, if we invested in this over 10 to 20 years, this is what the return could be. And I think a lot of that's kind of getting lost in translation because of the lack of skill sets to translate that across. So those are a few things that I would sort of say.
Definitely. I think you made a really good point about collaboration and different stakeholders. And another question that we have from the audience is about the types of companies that you work with. I assume these are the types of companies, when we say the types of companies that you work with, that would probably be the types of companies that you're like recommending your clients to use. So the question, I'll just read the question, is I'm curious as to how you determine which companies that you work with, do they need to meet a certain criteria? And so maybe Matthias or Julia, you could speak about this in terms of if a client comes to you with a problem and you're trying to recommend a solution, what types of companies would be the solution? And sort of how do you identify the different types of stakeholders that you need to address to create a solution?
I'll just mention a quick thing on mission alignment, and then maybe Julia can share some of her thoughts. We focus a lot on the mission of the client that we're working with, or the customer that we're working with, to make sure it aligns with our sort of worldview. We're not in the business of greenwashing. We turned down projects before that don't have impact alignment there, where they're really interested in continuing to do sort of business as usual type of activity that is harmful to the environment within the guise of something that is progressive, right? And this is where we're trying to make sure that these substantive activities that underlie an organization are really forwarding climate sort of progress goals, I suppose. I'll pass it over to Julia to talk a little bit more there as well.
Yeah, and I'll be brief here, as I know we have just a few minutes left, but I think one part of the question was, if someone was coming to us with a problem, who would we recommend in terms of like climate solutions or software? So this kind of ties back to like us doing our own due diligence to make sure that any software company or solution that we recommend, we actually have evaluated it and vetted it to make sure that the solutions it's providing are salient. And we would only recommend companies that we've actually seen, tested, know are worth their cost.
Great. And I love how you mentioned that, because at Voice, we always are talking about, you have to do your own research to know what companies are actually doing and if it matches what they say they're doing. So I really like how you mentioned that. I want to end on a final question from Mitch, because I think it's especially important for the students who are listening out there. The question is, what advice would you give to someone that wants to work in sustainability and help corporations with their sustainability efforts / ESG reporting? It seems like a growth sector. So maybe we can start with Julia and then Neil and Matthias. I know we only have 1 minute, but thank you.
Thanks, Abby. Yeah, I'll take this one as someone who does not have a sustainability or environmental science degree and ended up getting there. Ultimately, I think your passion for it and wanting to work there can go miles. There's so much else you can do outside of what's on your written resume and the jobs you've had. Take a course if you're interested in something, get volunteering done, find ways to educate yourself about sustainability if you haven't already. Otherwise, I think the sector is booming. They say there's a war for ESG talent. I think companies across the board are going to need to be working on this. And so the more, the better. We have resources. You can join an expert network if you want to start working in sustainability. And there's a bunch of job boards now, like Climate Base. I think especially at the analyst level or even at the associate level, show that you're passionate about it and that you're interested. And I think that can go a really long way because skills across the board and experiences across the board are needed here. Neil, would you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would say we have experts in training. We actually have a couple of half a dozen Cornell people working with us at the associate level. We believe in investing in diamonds in the rough. And so if you have a really badass skill set, like we were like more than willing to push it towards working on climate if there's a good fit. We really believe in that democratization of learning. And then if anything, just read. Like there's so much of this that's covered up in like SASB, GRI, all this stuff. It makes sense when you read it. So treat it like it's almost like an assignment to like learn more about this, and you'd be surprised how much you already know and that you can basically apply today in the field of sustainability.
And then I'll just finish with, we don't have time, so just apply your interest and get involved to make an impact sooner rather than later. Doing a PhD, which finishes in 8 years, for example, the fight's potentially already done. We need you on on projects working in climate. So if that's interesting, please reach out. We'd love to chat. Yeah, thanks.
Neil, Matthias, Julia, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our audience. I've definitely learned a lot, and thank you to Monica and everyone at CBIS for organizing this.
Thanks, team.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Abby. Thanks to the team at Cornell for putting this together. Thank you.